Hello, ladies and gents. This is the first sort of real lecture of the course. It will deal with all of the readings in Chapter 1 of Readings, the Macridis reading, the Levin March, and a little bit of the Zuckerman and Lichbach reading. But this first part I will spend exclusively on the Macridis reading, which is a survey of the field of comparative government. So Macridis will... The Macridis reading essentially is to set up a look at the sort of the traditional manner in which comparative government, as it was called then, or comparative politics, was studied by researchers. And Macridis, writing in the 1950s, was arguing for a new way to look at or to analyze comparative political phenomena. And he set up a series of criticisms of the manner in which the field had been studied to that point. And using these criticisms, we can sort of see how comparative politics has, for the most part, moved beyond the traditional approach to the study of comparative politics to encompass more modern, more socially scientifically approved approaches to the study of political phenomena. So what did Macridis see as the main problems of the traditional approach? Well, he essentially saw five, and most importantly was the fact that he argued that comparative politics was essentially non-comparative. In other words, there was very little explicit comparison, and we will be comparing a lot in this course. Generally the idea was that there were sort of analyses of single phenomena, single countries, case studies that weren't even implicitly comparative, let alone explicitly comparative. So there was a study of, the United States or the United States government without any sort of idea of, as I said, even implicitly comparing it to the Canadian government, the German government, let alone other governments around the world. So that was one. The second part, and probably I think the most important part, most important criticism, was that it was essentially a descriptive enterprise. In other words, when you think of description, right, you think of answering certain questions. Think about how you would describe the room or that you're sitting in. How would you describe it? Well, if you think about that for a second, you can pause this lecture for a second and think about that for a second. When you come back and press play again, you'll understand that how you describe it varies depending on your sort of implicit ideas of what the world is about. Right? Think of how a fire marshal would describe it, as opposed to, say, someone who is a political scientist, as opposed to someone who's an architect. These are implicitly different ways of viewing or describing the same phenomenon, right? And what we when we describe, though, we answer certain questions, right? Questions revolving around which question words. Once again, you can pause this for a second and think about which question words. Well, the question words that you answer or attempt to answer when you're describing are who, where, when, and what. What you aren't, the two words, the question words that are extremely important that are left out of description, are how and why. Okay, and these are extremely important. They move beyond sort of simply a descriptive approach to the study of political phenomena to a more social scientific. Why? Why do we see this phenomenon? Why is it that Canada has a universal healthcare system and the United States doesn't? Why does Canada have a multi-party political system and the United States doesn't? Why does Canada have a more social democratic political economy, whereas the United States is more classically liberal? So these all ask us for to think about causality and causal relations, and we'll get to causality in a couple of lectures. The third is that it was essentially parochial. Parochial comes from the French word meaning parish, meaning essentially local. And the biggest criticism of comparative politics in the first part of the 20th century was that, they looked at the same countries and they looked at a very few countries, and it was Western oriented, right? They looked at the United States, France, Germany, Great Britain, etc., and they didn't move beyond those countries. So, if we want to know something about the link between, between healthcare and healthcare coverage and, let's say, how rich a country is, well, we can learn a little bit by comparing countries within Western Europe, to the United States, but we can learn a lot more if we compare countries within Western Europe to countries in Asia and countries in South America and Africa. So by limiting the study of the countries that were studied, the discipline was harming itself. It was essentially static, meaning, of course, it didn't take account of changes. This is important, and we'll look at how societies have changed over time. And finally, it was essentially monographic, meaning that the analyses were focused on a distinct and singular phenomenon, like, for instance, the U.S. presidency, without caring to compare it to, say, the semi-presidential system in France, or the presidencies in Latin America, or the U.S. bureaucracy, the German healthcare system, etc. So these are monographs, meaning they're single representations of a political phenomenon. Okay, we'll get to part 2 in a second.